Three men rushed the wounded German Shepherd K9 at the same time, one grabbing for the torn collar, one blocking the trauma room door, and the third pulling an unmarked syringe from a black medical bag that did not belong to the hospital. The dog was bleeding from his left shoulder, one hind leg trembling beneath him, but he still dragged himself toward the unconscious man on the gurney. His claws scraped against the polished ER floor, leaving thin red lines behind him. Nobody in the hallway understood what was happening fast enough to stop it. They only saw Claire Monroe, the quiet night nurse everyone thought was too gentle for a crisis, step between three grown men and a military dog that could barely stand. The first man twisted the K9's collar so hard the dog's body buckled. The second man reached for Claire's arm to pull her out of the way. The third crouched beside the dog, not looking at the wound, not looking at the patient, only staring at the ripped padding on the collar as if whatever was hidden inside mattered more than the animal's life. Claire did not scream. She did not call for security. She saw the syringe angle toward the dog's neck, saw the German Shepherd clench his jaws through the pain so he would not abandon the unconscious veteran, and the softness people had mistaken for weakness disappeared from her face. She kicked the lower shelf of the emergency cart into the first man's knee. As he stumbled, she turned into the second man's grip instead of pulling away, wrapped a length of IV tubing around his wrist, and locked his arm with a precision that made him drop to one knee before he could shout. The third man lunged with the syringe. Claire snatched a stainless steel tray from the counter and struck his hand hard enough to send the syringe skidding across the floor beneath the medication cabinet. Everything happened in less than 10 seconds. The first man recovered and swung at her. Claire ducked under his arm, drove her shoulder into his ribs, and sent him backward into a linen cart. Sheets burst open and spilled across the hallway. The second man tried to rise, cursing through clenched teeth, but Claire tightened the IV tubing just enough to keep him pinned without breaking the joint. The third reached for the syringe again. The German Shepherd, wounded as he was, gave one sharp warning bark that made Claire turn at the exact moment the man's hand closed over the plastic barrel. Claire stepped on his wrist. The syringe cracked under her shoe. For the first time, the three men looked at her differently. Not as an obstacle, not as a nurse who had gotten emotional over an animal, as someone they had badly misjudged. Then the rest of the ER finally caught up. Nurses froze at the station. A respiratory tech backed into the wall. Someone yelled for security. Dr. Harlan, the attending physician on duty, came striding out of Trauma Bay 3 with his white coat open and irritation already hardening into outrage. He saw three men in medical transport uniforms on the floor, a bleeding K9 baring his teeth, and Claire standing between them with one torn sleeve and blood across her palm. He did not see the first shove. He did not see the syringe. He did not hear one of the men hiss, "Get the tag before anyone sees it." The hallway camera had not seen it either. Mounted above the nurse's station, it faced the wrong angle. It had captured Claire striking, Claire turning, Claire knocking men down in a hospital corridor. It had not captured the hand twisting the dog's collar. It had not captured the unmarked syringe. It had not captured the fear in the K9's eyes when the men reached for the torn padding around his neck. "Monroe!" Dr. Harlan shouted. "Step away from them now." Claire did not move. Her attention was on the dog. The German Shepherd had dragged himself halfway into the trauma room again. Every breath shook through his body. Blood darkened the fur over his shoulder and dotted the white tile beneath him. Still, he kept his chest angled toward the gurney where the unconscious man lay under harsh lights, oxygen tubing taped beneath his nose, a temporary hospital band around his wrist. John Doe, 47. That was what the band said. Not a name, not a life. Just a label printed by a system that had already decided he was nobody. The man had arrived 20 minutes earlier with no wallet, no phone, and no official identification. Local police had found him collapsed near the ambulance entrance after a disturbance in the parking lot. Witnesses claimed he had been shouting about a Navy team, a dog, and men coming to finish what they started. One officer called it paranoia. Another whispered stolen valor when they noticed the old military-style scars across his torso and the faded tattoo on his forearm, half-burned and unreadable. Dr. Harlan had treated him like a problem to be contained. Possible psychiatric break. Possible violent drifter. Possible fake veteran. Stabilize him, sedate him, transfer him when cleared. That was the plan before the German Shepherd appeared from the rain, limping through the ambulance doors with a torn leash dragging behind him and a sound in his throat that made every person in the ER stop talking. He had gone straight to John Doe, 47, not to the food cart, not to the nurses, not to the warm blankets stacked near the trauma bay. He had gone to the unconscious man and planted himself beside the gurney like a soldier returning to his post. That was the first thing Claire noticed. The second was that he was not wild. A frightened stray snapped at anything that came close. A panicked dog lunged without pattern. This German Shepherd watched hands, corners, exits. He let a nurse pass with saline. He let Claire approach with gauze. But when Dr. Harlan ordered an orderly to pull the patient's belongings away from the bed, the dog had lifted his head and growled so low the room seemed to tighten around the sound. The belongings were nothing at first glance. A soaked canvas jacket, a cracked leather belt, a small folded photograph blurred by rain, a piece of old uniform fabric with the name Strip cut cleanly away. No wallet, no dog tags. Nothing that proved John Doe 47 had ever been anything except a man the hospital wanted moved before morning. Then the transport team arrived too fast. Claire had seen real medical transport crews before. They were tired, overworked, and full of forms. These men moved like they had rehearsed the hallway. Their badges hung too new. Their paperwork had the right shape and the wrong details. One logo was slightly off. One phone number was missing a digit. One man kept touching his left side under his jacket, the way people did when they were checking a weapon they were not supposed to have. Claire had asked Dr. Harlan to wait. He had told her she was letting sympathy cloud her judgment. Now 3 men were on the floor. The canine was still bleeding, and the unmarked syringe lay broken under Claire's shoe. Security arrived with heavy footsteps and worse timing. 2 guards came around the corner, hands raised, eyes jumping from the men on the floor to Claire. Behind them, Mia, the youngest nurse on the shift, looked pale and frightened, but her gaze dropped to the black medical bag before anyone else's did. Claire saw her notice it. She saw Mia's face change when she realized the syringe case had no hospital barcode. "Restrain the dog," Dr. Harlan ordered, "and get Nurse Monroe out of this hallway." The canine's lips lifted. Claire turned her head slightly. "Do not touch him." The words were quiet, but something in them stopped the nearest guard for half a second. Dr. Harlan stepped closer, furious now. He accused her of assaulting authorized transport personnel. He said she had endangered staff and patients. He said the dog was a liability, and the unidentified man in Trauma Bay 3 was not worth turning the ER into a battlefield. Claire finally looked at him. Not long, just enough. Then she crouched slowly, lowering herself to the German Shepherd's level. The dog's ears shifted toward her. His eyes were dark, sharp, and full of pain, but he did not growl. Claire held out her blood-streaked hand, palm down, giving him the chance to reject her. He did not. Instead, he leaned forward and pressed his muzzle against her knuckles, pushing her hand toward the torn collar. The ripped padding opened slightly beneath her fingers. Something metal glinted inside. Claire's breath caught, but she kept her face still. The third transport man, still on the floor, saw her notice it. His expression changed from pain to panic. "Get her away from that dog," he said. That was the wrong thing to say. The canine surged up with the last of his strength, not toward the guards, not toward Dr. Harlan, but toward the gurney. He dragged himself to the bedside and placed one shaking paw on the unconscious man's chest. The heart monitor jumped once, then steadied. John Doe 47's fingers twitched against the blanket. Claire looked from the dog to the temporary hospital band, then back to the torn collar where the hidden metal waited beneath blood and padding. The hospital thought the patient had no name. The men in transport uniforms clearly knew he did. And the wounded German Shepherd was the only one in the room, still brave enough to protect it. The hospital band on the unconscious man's wrist said John Doe 47, but Claire Monroe knew before the first scan came back that the name was only a placeholder for a truth someone had worked very hard to erase. He lay beneath the bright trauma lights with rainwater still drying in his hair and a warming blanket pulled to his chest, his face pale from blood loss and exhaustion. The chart made him sound simple. Unidentified male, possible psychiatric disturbance, possible assaultive behavior, possible stolen valor claim. But the body on the gurney told a different story. Claire saw old surgical scars along his ribs, a healed wound beneath the collarbone, and a faded burn mark crossing part of a tattoo on his forearm. Those details did not prove he was a Navy SEAL, but they proved he was not merely the confused drifter the room had already decided he was. He had been brought in less than half an hour earlier by two local officers who looked more annoyed than concerned. They said he had collapsed near the ambulance entrance after causing a disturbance outside the ER. One officer claimed the man had taken a swing at someone before dropping to his knees. Another said he had been yelling about a dog, a team, and men coming to finish something. When Claire asked whether he had identification, the officer shook his head and said the patient had no wallet, no phone, no driver's license, and no military ID. Then he added, with the casual cruelty people used when they thought the person on the bed could not hear them, that the man was probably another stolen valor case trying to make himself sound important. Doctor. Harlan accepted that explanation too quickly. He was a capable ER doctor, but he trusted clean labels more than complicated people. To him, John Doe 47 was a liability. Unstable, unidentified, possibly violent, and now attached to a bleeding German shepherd that had forced its way into the hospital. He ordered the usual workup, told staff to prepare for sedation if the patient became combative again, and mentioned a psychiatric transfer as soon as the man was medically cleared. The words sounded professional enough, but Claire heard the judgment beneath them. The patient had been sorted before anyone had truly listened. Claire did not challenge him in front of the whole room. That was not her way. She checked the man's pupils, monitored his pulse, adjusted his oxygen, and studied the small things that did not fit. His knuckles were scraped, but the bruising on his forearms looked defensive, as if he had protected himself from blows rather than started a fight. There was a fresh injection mark near his shoulder that did not match anything administered by the ER team. His clothes, cut away during intake, were soaked through but not filthy in the way of someone who had been living outside for months. He smelled of rain, smoke, and antiseptic, not of alcohol. None of these observations alone could clear his name, but together they made Claire slow down when everyone else wanted the case moved along. Then the German shepherd had come through the ambulance doors. The dog had entered the ER with a torn leash dragging behind him and blood running down one front leg. Security reached for a catch pole before the animal had taken 5 steps, but the canine never looked at the guard. He lifted his head, found a scent through the harsh mixture of bleach, wet pavement, and human fear, then limped straight toward Trauma Bay 3. He did not hesitate at the noise of monitors. He did not shy away from the rolling carts. He did not wander toward food, warmth, or open space. He went directly to the unconscious man and lowered himself beside the gurney as if returning to a post he had been ordered to hold. That was the moment Claire first understood the dog was not lost. A frightened stray would have snapped at movement, backed into a corner, or bolted from the chaos of the ER. This German shepherd did none of that. He watched hands. He tracked doors. He positioned his body between the patient and the hallway. When a nurse moved closer with saline, he allowed it. When Claire approached with gauze, sterile water, and a calm voice, he gave a warning rumble, but did not bite. Yet when an orderly tried to gather the patient's belongings from the chair beside the bed, the dog rose despite his injury and released a low growl that stopped the orderly cold. Claire had noticed the pattern immediately. The canine protected the patient, the belongings, and, most fiercely, the torn collar around his own neck. Those were not random attachments. They were priorities. The belongings looked ordinary at first glance, which made Claire more suspicious. A soaked canvas jacket lay folded over a cracked leather belt. A pair of socks had been placed in a clear plastic bag. There was a damaged photograph, a small piece of old uniform fabric, and nothing else. No wallet, no tags, no phone, no key ring, nothing personal enough to tie John Doe 47 to a real life. The absence felt too complete. People who vanished by accident usually left behind some trace of themselves. This man looked as if his identity had been stripped away by someone who knew exactly what to remove. Claire kept one eye on the German shepherd while she lifted the old fabric. It had once been part of a uniform sleeve or shoulder panel. The edges were worn, but the places where patches had been cut away were clean. A name strip had been removed. A unit insignia had been removed. Even the stitching marks looked deliberate. Whoever had taken those pieces had not ripped them in panic. They had erased them with care. The dog watched her fingers. His breathing was harsh, his injured shoulder trembling, but he did not stop her. Claire set the fabric down and picked up the photograph. Rain had blurred much of the image, turning faces and background into gray smears, but two shapes remained clear enough to matter. One was a man in tactical gear, his face partly turned from the camera. The other was a German shepherd, sitting beside him with ears high and posture steady. The dog in the photograph looked younger and uninjured, but the eyes were unmistakable. Claire glanced down at the wounded K9 by the gurney. He gave a slow breath through his nose, as if the sight of the photograph cost him something. Dr. Harlan stepped close enough to see what she was holding and let out an impatient sigh. He told her they were not going to build a fantasy around wet clothing and a dog that happened to follow a scent. Claire did not answer. She had learned that some people listened only after reality forced them to. Instead, she placed the photograph beside the uniform fabric and looked again at the patient. His heart rate had risen when the dog moved. It eased when the dog settled against the bed. His fingers, motionless moments before, twitched faintly when the German shepherd pressed his muzzle near the blanket. Mia, the youngest nurse on the shift, saw it too. She stood near the supply counter with gauze in one hand, still pale from the fight that had just happened in the hallway. Her eyes moved from the patient's fingers to the dog, then to Claire. She did not speak, but Claire could see the room's certainty beginning to crack inside her. It took courage for a young nurse to doubt the loudest doctor in the ER, and Mia was not ready to say anything yet. But she had seen what Claire had seen. Outside the trauma bay, security continued to hover near the three men in gray uniforms. They still claimed to be medical transport, though no one had explained why one of them carried an unmarked syringe case, or why they had tried to take the dog's collar before anyone completed the transfer paperwork. One of the men sat against the wall, cradling his wrist and watching Claire with an anger too focused to be embarrassment. When his eyes landed on the photograph, his expression changed. For a brief second, pain gave way to alarm. The German shepherd saw it too. He pushed himself up too fast, nearly collapsing on his injured leg, and forced his body between the man and the chair holding the belongings. His teeth showed, but again he did not lunge. His warning was controlled, specific, and directed only at the men who had come for him. Claire stepped closer to the dog, not to restrain him, but to support the line he was trying to hold. Dr. Harlan misread that too. He ordered the dog removed and told Claire to stop interfering before the hospital had a lawsuit, an injured staff member, and an unidentified violent patient on its hands. He called John Doe 47 unstable. He called the K9 dangerous. He called Claire emotional. Each word made the situation simpler for him and more dangerous for everyone else. Claire looked at the temporary band around the man's wrist, John Doe 47. It was clean, printed, official, and meaningless. The dog had crossed rain and blood to find him. Three men with false confidence had arrived before proper authorization. The patient's belongings had been stripped of identifying marks. The K9 guarded the bed like a soldier and guarded the collar like evidence. None of it belonged to the story the hospital wanted to believe. Mia stepped close enough that only Claire could hear her. Her voice trembled as she said the transport team had arrived before she finished entering any transfer request. Claire kept her eyes on the men in the hallway and asked who had called them. Mia swallowed, then admitted that no one from their desk had. At that exact moment, the phone at the nurse's station rang. A unit clerk answered, listened, and turned toward Trauma Bay 3 with confusion on her face. She said the official medical transport company was on the line asking whether the patient had been cleared for pickup later that morning. Claire looked from the phone to the three men already inside the ER. The wounded German shepherd lowered his head over the cut piece of uniform fabric and placed one bloodied paw on the missing name strip. The unconscious man's monitor ticked faster, as if some buried part of him understood the trap closing around him. The hospital thought John Doe 47 had no identity. The dog knew he had one, and the men in gray had arrived to make sure no one ever found it. The official medical transport company was still on the phone asking for clearance when Claire looked at the three men already standing inside the ER and understood that the hospital had let the wrong people walk through its doors. No one said it out loud at first. The unit clerk stood at the nurse's station with the receiver pressed to her ear, her mouth slightly open, listening to a dispatcher who sounded confused on the other end. Mia stood beside the trauma bay, pale and silent. "Doctor," Harlan's expression tightened, not because he believed Claire yet, but because even he could hear the problem forming in the space between the phone call and the men in gray uniforms. The tallest of the three tried to recover first. He was still holding his injured wrist close to his chest, but his voice returned to that polished, official calm. He said, "There must have been a scheduling overlap." He said specialized animal containment had been requested separately. He said the patient's situation had been escalated because of the dog's aggression and the risk to hospital staff. The explanation sounded smooth enough for anyone who wanted the night to become simple again, but Claire watched his eyes while he spoke. They did not move toward the patient's monitor, the wound on the dog's shoulder, or the paperwork in Dr. Harlan's hand. They kept sliding toward the torn collar. The German Shepherd noticed too. He remained low beside the gurney, body pressed against the metal frame, breath dragging roughly through his muzzle. His bloodied paw still rested near the cut piece of uniform fabric, as if he were marking it for the only person in the room willing to understand. When the tallest man shifted his weight closer, the dog's ears came forward. He did not bark. He did not waste strength. A controlled growl rose from his chest, so low that Claire felt it more than heard it. "Doctor." Harlan held up a clipboard that one of the men had brought in earlier. "This says they're authorized to remove the animal and transfer the patient once stabilized." Claire turned toward him. "Then why is the company on our phone asking if they're scheduled for later this morning?" "That could be a clerical duplication." "It could be," Claire said, keeping her voice even. "So verify it before anyone leaves with the dog or the patient." The second man, the one whose arm she had pinned with IV tubing, gave a short laugh. He had the kind of face that looked friendlier when he was lying. "Nurse, with respect, you already made this situation worse. We're here to prevent further harm." Claire looked at the broken syringe case, partly visible beneath the medication cabinet. Mia had seen it too, and Claire could feel the young nurse's attention moving toward the same place. The case had cracked when Claire stepped on it. A piece of clear plastic stuck out from under the cabinet, along with the white end of an unlabeled barrel. No hospital pharmacy sticker, no patient name, no dosage marking, nothing that belonged in a legitimate transfer. "You brought medication into my ER without pharmacy verification," Claire said. The man's smile faded. "Animal sedative. Standard precaution. For a dog you hadn't examined. For a dangerous dog that attacked medical personnel." The German Shepherd's growl deepened at the word dangerous, though the dog's eyes were not on the speaker's face. They were on his hands. That mattered to Claire. The K9 was not reacting to tone or volume. He was tracking intention, movement, and threat. He let Mia step closer with gauze. He allowed the respiratory tech to adjust a tube near the bed. He had even allowed Claire to touch the torn collar for a moment. But whenever one of the men in gray moved within reach of the patient's belongings or the collar, the dog became a wall of teeth and discipline. Claire took the clipboard from Dr. Harlan before he could object. She did not snatch it. She simply held out her hand, and perhaps because everyone was now watching the phone, the men, and the dog at once, he let her take it. The form looked official at a glance. Letterhead, transfer number, patient designation, destination facility, staff signatures. But the longer she looked, the more the details broke apart. The hospital logo was slightly compressed. The emergency contact line used an old department name from before the ER's system update. The destination facility was real, but the extension listed beside it had only 6 digits. The signature at the bottom was a printed block of text, not an authorization from any charge nurse on duty. Claire handed the paper to Mia. "Check the facility extension." Mia looked at Dr. Harlan first. He did not approve, but he did not stop her either. She stepped to the side phone, dialed carefully, and waited. The entire hallway seemed to hold its breath while the call rang into nothing, then ended with the flat recorded message that the number was not in service. The third man finally lost patience. He was shorter than the others, broad through the shoulders, with a trimmed beard and eyes that kept measuring exits. "This is becoming obstruction," he said. "We have federal authorization to remove a hazardous animal connected to an unidentified violent subject." "Show it," Claire said. He stared at her. "What?" "Federal authorization. Show it." His jaw tightened. Dr. Harlan exhaled sharply. "Nurse Monroe, that is enough." "No," Claire said. "It isn't." The words were quiet, but they changed the room again. Claire had spent years making herself small enough not to invite questions. She had learned the value of silence, learned that people revealed more when they thought she had no authority. But silence had limits. A wounded canine was bleeding on her floor. An unconscious man had been stripped of his name. 3 strangers had come for both of them before the real transport company had even been dispatched. If Claire let procedure become a blindfold now, the truth would leave the ER under a gray uniform and never come back. The tallest man shifted toward the dog. The canine lifted his head. Claire stepped between them. For a second, the hallway went still around her. Behind her, she could hear the patient's monitor, the soft hiss of oxygen, the strained breathing of the German Shepherd. In front of her stood 3 men who had stopped pretending to be tired transport staff. Their bodies had changed, shoulders squared, feet angled, hands no longer visible in the harmless way medical staff kept them. They were waiting for someone in authority to remove Claire so they could finish what they came to do. "Doctor?" Harlan became that authority almost by reflex. "Security," he said. "Move Nurse Monroe away from the animal." The nearest guard hesitated. He was a large man named Daniels, and Claire had seen him calm drunk relatives, confused patients, and frightened children with the same steady patience. He looked from Claire to the dog, then to the men in gray. Something in his face suggested he did not like the picture any more than she did. The second transport man noticed the hesitation and seized on it. "Doctor, we have a limited window. If that dog bites someone else, this hospital is responsible." "The dog hasn't bitten anyone," Mia said suddenly. Every eye turned toward her. Her voice wavered, but she kept going. "He warned them. He didn't attack anyone until they grabbed his collar. He let Nurse Monroe touch him." Dr. Harlan's frustration sharpened. "Mia, stay out of this." But the small statement had done damage. It named the thing everyone had been avoiding. The German Shepherd's behavior was not random. It was selective. And selective meant intelligent, trained, purposeful. Claire bent slowly toward the dog without taking her eyes off the 3 men. "Easy," she murmured. The canine's breathing hitched. His shoulder wound had reopened during the fight, and fresh blood slid down his leg. Even then, he turned his body so the torn collar faced away from the men and toward Claire. The motion was subtle, but the tallest man saw it. His gaze snapped to the padding, and for one unguarded second, fear crossed his face. Not fear of the dog, fear of what the dog carried. Claire reached into the pocket of her scrub top and felt the fake ID she had taken during the hallway fight. She had not shown it yet. She needed the right moment, the right witness, the right chain of evidence. 3 men with bad paperwork could still become a misunderstanding. 3 men with bad paperwork, an unmarked syringe, a false ID, and a wounded canine guarding a hidden object would be much harder for Dr. Harlan to dismiss as emotion. The unit clerk called out from the nurse's station again. The real transport dispatcher had confirmed they had not sent any staff to the hospital yet. Their first crew was still 20 minutes away. The short, bearded man cursed under his breath. Claire heard it. So did Daniels. The guard's hand moved away from his restraint cuffs. Dr. Harlan looked at the 3 men, then at Claire, caught between embarrassment and denial. "There may have been a communication error," he said. "No," Claire replied. "There was an infiltration." The word landed hard. Too hard for a hospital corridor. Too hard for a case that was supposed to be about an unidentified patient and a dangerous dog. One of the men gave a quick glance toward the side exit. Claire saw it and knew the next phase would not be paperwork. They had come in expecting obedience. Now that they were being questioned, they would either force the transfer or destroy what they came for. The German Shepherd suddenly pushed himself upright. His legs trembled, but he did not fall. He stepped backward, closer to the patient, and lowered his head over the torn collar, as if shielding it with his own skull. The unconscious man's fingers twitched again, brushing the edge of the blanket. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Claire leaned close enough to catch the faintest breath. It sounded like a name. Not John, not Doe. Before she could ask Mia to document it, the tallest man reached for the clipboard, trying to snatch back the forged paperwork. Claire held it out of reach and locked eyes with him. "No one is signing this," she said. "No one takes the dog. No one moves the patient. Not until every name in this room is verified." The German Shepherd gave one low, broken growl, and for the first time that night, The men in gray understood that the quiet nurse and the wounded K9 were standing on the same side of a secret they had failed to bury. Dr. Harlan did not like the word infiltration. It made the ER feel less like a controlled medical unit and more like a place that had already failed before anyone understood the failure. His face tightened as Claire held the forged transfer paperwork out of the tallest man's reach, and for a brief moment the entire hallway waited for him to choose between what was written on a clipboard and what was bleeding on the floor in front of him. The wrong choice was easier. It always was. The clipboard had lines, signatures, and official-looking language. The wounded German shepherd had blood on his fur, teeth showing, and no way to explain that he was guarding the only truth in the room. "This is still my emergency department," Dr. Harlan said, forcing his voice into the cold authority he used when he wanted questions to end. "And I will not have a nurse turn it into a standoff because she thinks she sees a conspiracy in bad paperwork." Claire looked past him to the three men in gray. The tallest one had gone silent, his injured wrist tucked against his chest. The bearded one watched Daniels, the security guard, with an expression that measured how quickly he could get around him. The second man kept his eyes on the trauma bay, not on the patient's monitor or the oxygen line, but on the German shepherd's torn collar. Every answer Claire needed was in the way they refused to look where innocent men would look. "The official transport company says they have no team here," Claire said. "That means we verify, Doctor." Harlan replied. "It does not mean you issue orders." "I'm not issuing orders. I'm stopping an unsafe transfer. You assaulted 3 men. They attacked the dog. They are on the floor, Nurse Monroe. And the dog is bleeding because one of them twisted his collar trying to take something from it." The words made the second man's jaw flex. It was small, but Claire caught it. So did the K9. His ears shifted, and a low rumble moved through his chest. His body was weakening. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight was fading, leaving tremors along his hindquarters and a growing pool of blood beneath his injured shoulder. Still, he did not lie down. Still, he kept himself between the men and the bed. Dr. Harlan glanced at the blood and misread the entire scene again. Exactly why the animal needs to be removed. He is unstable, injured, and dangerous. "He is trained," Claire said. "He is a liability. He has not threatened anyone who wasn't reaching for the patient, the belongings, or his collar. That is not a medical assessment." "No," Claire said softly. "It's observation." That word seemed to irritate him more than defiance would have. Claire had built her career on observation. She noticed the patient who stopped joking before his pressure crashed. She noticed the veteran who said he was fine while his fingers trembled at every overhead page. She noticed the child who smiled at the nurse but flinched when a particular adult entered the room. In a hospital, the truth often arrived quietly before the labs confirmed it. But Dr. Harlan trusted measurable things, and Claire's certainty had not yet become measurable enough for him. He turned to Daniels. "Escort Nurse Monroe out of the trauma bay. She is relieved from this case. Pending review." Mia's eyes widened, but she said nothing. The unit clerk lowered the phone slowly. The respiratory tech looked away. No one wanted to stand against an attending physician in the middle of an already dangerous night. Claire understood that fear. Hospitals had rank, and rank had consequences. A nurse could be right and still lose her job if she challenged the wrong doctor in the wrong tone with the wrong witness watching. Claire handed the forged paperwork to Mia instead of Dr. Harlan. "Do not let this leave the desk," Dr. Harlan snapped. "That is not your decision." Mia held the clipboard with both hands, caught between obedience and conscience. The K9's growl softened into a strained whine, and Claire looked down. The dog was staring at her now, not at the men. He pulled one front paw beneath him and tried to rise higher, but his shoulder failed. His body dipped. Claire stepped toward him on instinct. Daniels moved to block her. "Claire." He used her first name, not her title. That told her he did not want to do this. His hand hovered near her elbow but did not close around it. Claire respected him enough not to make him choose too early. "I need to pack the wound," she said. "He's losing blood." Dr. Harlan cut in before Daniels could answer. "Animal control can handle the dog. He may not last until they arrive. That is not your call." Claire held his gaze. "Then make the call as a doctor, not as a man trying to prove he wasn't wrong." The hallway went still. Dr. Harlan's expression changed in a way that told Claire she had finally struck the place pride lived. His voice dropped. "Step away from the animal and the patient. Now." The bearded man took advantage of the moment. He moved half a step toward the trauma bay, just enough that someone not watching closely might think he was only shifting his stance. The K9 saw him and forced himself upright again. A sharp sound tore from his throat. Not a bark, not a snarl, a warning shaped by pain. Claire stepped backward, as if obeying. The dog panicked. It was the first time she saw real fear in him. Not fear of pain, not fear of strangers, but fear that the one person he had chosen was leaving before he could give her what he had carried there. He dragged himself toward her, leaving a darker streak of blood behind, and pressed his muzzle hard against her hand. Then he turned his head awkwardly, pushing the torn, padded section of his collar beneath her fingers. Claire froze. No dog did that by accident. The hallway narrowed to the feeling of blood-wet fabric under her fingertips, and the hard shape hidden beneath it. The object inside the collar was small, flat, and oval-edged. Metal. It shifted slightly when she pressed, caught between padding and dried blood. The K9 stood absolutely still despite the pain, allowing her touch and only her touch. When Daniels leaned in to see, the dog's lips lifted. When Claire's hand remained, he calmed. Mia whispered, "He's letting her." Dr. Harlan heard her and looked furious that the obvious had acquired a witness. Claire kept her fingers light. She could not remove the object there. Not with the dog bleeding and 3 hostile men watching every movement. The collar had been modified. Not factory padding, not ordinary wear. Someone had opened the seam, placed the metal inside, and stitched it closed again with dark thread. Later, injury had torn the fabric just enough to reveal the edge. The K9 had not simply been wearing evidence. He had been carrying it in the only place he could still defend with his body. The second man saw Claire understand. His face went flat. "Doctor," he said, voice controlled but urgent, "the longer this continues, the more risk your hospital assumes. The animal needs to be sedated immediately." Claire looked at him. "You mean silenced?" Dr. Harlan pointed toward the hall. "Enough. Daniels, remove her." This time, Daniels took Claire's arm. His grip was gentle, almost apologetic, but it was still a grip. Claire let him guide her 2 steps back. Fighting hospital security would only give the men what they wanted, a reason to isolate her completely. She needed time, witnesses, and one clear chance to get that collar open. The German Shepherd tried to follow. His injured leg slipped. He nearly collapsed, then caught himself against the gurney. The unconscious man's hand twitched at the movement, fingers curling weakly against the blanket. His heart rate ticked upward on the monitor. The bearded man leaned closer to the patient's ear, pretending to check the side rail. His voice dropped so low most of the room missed it. "Clean transfer," he murmured. The reaction was immediate. John Doe 47's hand clenched the sheet with sudden force. His pulse spiked. A sound caught in his throat, rough and trapped beneath sedation and injury. The German Shepherd lunged forward as far as his body allowed, teeth flashing, but stopped short of the bed as if trained not to endanger the man he was protecting. Claire heard the phrase. She saw the patient's response. She saw the K9 respond to the response. Clean transfer was not medical language. Not the way he said it. It was a trigger, a threat, or a memory sharp enough to pull a half-conscious man toward panic. "Doctor." Harlan noticed the spike on the monitor, but not the cause. "He's destabilizing. Clear the room." "No," Claire said. He reacted to what that man said. The bearded man straightened, innocent again. "I didn't say anything." Mia looked at Claire, frightened. She had not heard it. Daniels had been watching Claire's hands. The unit clerk was still near the phone. The moment had passed, with almost no witness except the patient, the dog, and the nurse. Everyone had decided was emotional. Dr. Harlan's patience ended. "Remove her from Trauma Bay 3. Daniels pulled Claire farther into the hallway. This time she let herself be moved, but her eyes stayed on the K9. The German Shepherd stood shaking beside the bed, torn collar turned toward her, blood dripping from his shoulder, his gaze locked on hers with a plea that felt almost human in its discipline. Claire understood the message. The men wanted the collar, the patient feared the words. The hospital had chosen procedure over warning signs because procedure felt safer than admitting danger had already entered the ER. At the doorway, Claire glanced once at Mia and spoke quietly enough that Dr. Harlan would think it was nothing. "Get me a suture kit and hemostatic gauze." Mia's lips parted, but Claire was already being pulled into the hall. Behind her, the German Shepherd gave one broken, furious growl as the men in gray stepped closer to the bed, and Claire knew she had only minutes to return before the wrong name on that hospital band became the only name Elias Rourke would ever be allowed to have. Daniels escorted Claire away from Trauma Bay 3 with a hand that barely touched her elbow, as if even he understood that forcing her out of the room felt wrong. The main ER corridor still buzzed behind them with too many voices pretending to be control. "Doctor." Harlan was issuing orders in clipped bursts. The three men in gray medical transport uniforms were being watched but not restrained. The wounded German Shepherd kept giving low, broken warnings from beside the unconscious patient, and every warning made the men glance toward the torn collar with a fear they were trying to disguise as impatience. Claire let herself be moved because fighting security in the open hallway would only bury the truth faster. The cameras were already against her. The first fight had been recorded from the wrong angle, showing her striking men who looked official without showing the hand twisting the K9's collar or the unmarked syringe aimed at his neck. If she resisted now, Doctor, Harlan would have everything he needed to isolate her completely. So she lowered her eyes, softened her shoulders, and let the hospital see the quiet nurse again, while her mind counted exits, witnesses, camera angles, and seconds. The supply hall behind the ER was narrow and colder than the treatment area. Metal shelves lined the walls behind locked glass. Linen carts crowded the corners. Boxes of sterile gloves and wound kits sat stacked beneath a humming fluorescent panel. Claire had spent hundreds of night shifts walking that hall, gathering gauze for patients who apologized for bleeding and blankets for old veterans who pretended they were not cold. Tonight, the same hallway felt like the thin space between a mistake and a cover-up. Daniels paused near the keypad outside the supply room. He looked back toward the trauma bay, where the German Shepherd's growl rose again, then faded into a strained whine. Claire did not beg him. She did not waste time explaining what he already suspected. She simply asked for access to wound supplies, keeping her voice low and professional, framing it not as defiance but as patient care. The K9's shoulder was open. He had lost too much blood. If animal control arrived with poles and restraints, the dog would fight them, not because he was vicious, but because he had already chosen what he was protecting. Daniels hesitated only a moment before entering his code. The lock clicked. He opened the supply room and stood aside, saying nothing that would force him to choose a side on camera. Claire understood the mercy in that silence. She stepped inside and let the door drift almost shut behind her. The room smelled of cardboard, disinfectant, and plastic packaging. Claire moved quickly along the shelves, taking hemostatic gauze, saline flushes, chlorhexidine, pressure wrap, sterile pads, trauma shears, and a suture kit. She chose each item with the speed of habit and the caution of someone preparing to treat a wounded working dog without frightening him. Her hand hovered over a muzzle strap for half a second, then moved past it. The German Shepherd had shown more discipline than most people in the ER. Putting a restraint over his mouth would only tell him she had failed to understand the difference between danger and duty. A reflection shifted in the stainless steel cabinet door. Claire did not turn. The supply room door opened wider behind her without a knock. The man who entered was the second transport imposter, the one with the smooth voice and the arm she had pinned in the hallway. He had wrapped his injured wrist against his chest, but his other hand remained free, low, and ready. He let the door close softly, sealing away the sounds of the ER until the monitors and voices became muffled through the wall. Claire kept arranging supplies in the basin, watching his reflection instead of giving him the full attention he wanted. He stood between her and the door. That was his first mistake. Men who believed strength solved everything often chose the obvious position. They blocked exits, crowded space, and expected fear to do the rest. Claire had learned long ago that small rooms punished obvious men. He began with threats dressed as advice. He warned her that Dr. Harlan had already removed her from the case, that the camera had recorded enough to end her nursing license, that no board would believe a night nurse over authorized transport staff. His voice stayed calm, but his eyes kept dropping to the basin. He was not concerned about the gauze or saline, He was calculating whether she had already taken something from the dog's collar. Claire let him talk while she shifted her weight. The supply cart was to her left. The lower shelf held sealed irrigation bottles. A roll of elastic bandage lay within reach. Trauma shears rested on top of the basin. The floor near the sink had a slight slope toward the drain. All of it entered her mind as quietly as vital signs on a monitor. She did not want to hurt him. She wanted him unable to keep walking toward the dog. Then he said the one thing that removed any remaining doubt. He told her the collar needed to be handed over before the animal forced everyone into a worse outcome. He did not call the German Shepherd a patient. He did not call him a working dog. He called him the animal, the same way a man might refer to a locked box that happened to breathe. Claire picked up the basin and turned toward the door. He stepped in front of her, close enough that she could see sweat at his hairline and a faint adhesive mark near his jaw, where a fake beard or comms patch might have been removed earlier. He reached for the basin first, not for her. That confirmed the supplies were not what mattered. He thought she might have hidden the collar evidence among them. When Claire did not release it, his hand shot to the front of her scrub top and shoved her backward into the metal shelf. Boxes of gauze fell around her shoulder. Pain flashed across her ribs where she struck the edge, but she let the impact turn her rather than stop her. The basin dropped, scattering saline, bandages, and sterile packs across the floor. The man lunged to grab her again. Claire caught a falling irrigation bottle, drove it into his forearm, and used the split second of pain to step inside his reach. She did not swing wildly. She did not fight like someone trying to prove anger. She fought like someone counting anatomy. Her palm struck the center of his chest, just hard enough to break his balance. Her foot hooked behind his ankle. As he stumbled, she looped a roll of elastic bandage around his wrist and pulled his arm across his own body. He tried to power through the hold, using his weight to force her into the cabinet, but the spilled saline had slicked the floor beneath him. His shoe slid. Claire shifted behind him, guided his trapped wrist down toward the cart handle, and turned the joint into an angle his strength could not solve. He swore through his teeth and reached beneath his jacket with his free hand. Claire moved before she knew what he was reaching for. She kicked the supply cart into his hip, knocking him sideways, and something black dropped from inside his jacket. It hit the floor with a hard plastic crack and slid under the lower shelf. Not a weapon, at least not one meant to fire. A compact radio. The small red light on its side blinked once, then went dark as it struck the wall. The man's expression changed when he lost it. That radio mattered. He drove backward with sudden force, slamming Claire into the shelving. The breath left her lungs. For 1 second, his hand closed around her throat, pressing her against cold metal while his face came close enough for her to smell mint and fear. He told her she had no idea what the unconscious man had done, no idea how many names had been buried to keep men like him from crawling back into the light. Then, with a bitterness that did not belong to a transport worker, he called her by a name no one in that hospital knew: Mercy. The old name moved through Claire like a blade sliding out of its sheath. She had spent years making Claire Monroe ordinary. Night nurse. Quiet charting. Soft voice. No stories about deployments. No explanations for the blank space before the hospital hired her. She had buried Mercy under medication schedules, wound care, and the steady rhythm of civilian suffering. But the man's mistake was thinking the name would frighten her. It did not. It reminded her what kind of people used hidden names as weapons. Claire drove 2 fingers into the nerve cluster beneath his wrist, breaking his grip just enough to breathe. She caught the trauma shears from the floor, not to cut him, but to hook the fabric of his sleeve and pull his arm across the cabinet handle. The motion trapped him in his own jacket. She stepped behind him, tightened the elastic bandage, and brought his shoulder into a controlled lock that forced him down to one knee. He fought for several seconds, powerful and furious, until pain made his body understand what pride refused to accept. When he finally went still, Claire searched him with one hand, while keeping the lock in place. Inside his jacket, she found an ID badge clipped backward. The name read Aaron Vale, Medical Transfer Specialist, but the laminate was wrong. The barcode printed flat. The hospital affiliation outdated by years. Beneath it was a second card with no photograph, only a magnetic strip and a faded emblem pressed into one corner. Claire recognized the shape from the cut marks on the uniform fabric in John Doe's belongings. Someone had removed that same symbol from the patient's past, and this man was still carrying it. The supply room door opened. Daniel stood in the threshold, his radio in one hand, static hissing from the speaker. He took in the scattered supplies, Claire's bruised throat, the man pinned against the shelving, and the fake ID in her hand. For one dangerous second, the scene looked exactly like every camera had been trained to accuse her of creating. Then the German Shepherd barked from Trauma Bay 3. 3 sharp bursts. Controlled. Urgent. A warning. Not panic. Claire released just enough pressure to keep the man pinned without injuring him further, and looked at Daniels. The guard's eyes moved from the fake badge to the dead radio under the shelf. Understanding hardened his face. The attack in the supply room had never been the main move. It was only meant to keep Claire away while the other 2 men reached the dog, the collar, and the unconscious veteran with the wrong name. By the time Claire stepped out of the supply room with the fake ID hidden in her scrub pocket and bruises rising along her throat, the hospital had already begun shaping the story without her. In the main corridor, Dr. Harlan stood near the nurses' station with security on one side and the 2 remaining men in gray uniforms on the other, speaking in the clipped, official tone people used when they wanted fear to sound like policy. The words assault, unstable nurse, dangerous animal, and unauthorized interference moved through the ER faster than facts. Claire could feel the narrative closing around her before she reached Trauma Bay 3. The man she had pinned in the supply room was still on the floor behind Daniels, groaning but alive, his arm secured behind his back with a restraint cuff the guard had finally decided to use. The fake badge in Claire's pocket felt heavier than plastic. The second magnetic card, the one with the faded emblem, pressed against her ribs beneath the folded gauze she had taken for the K9. She wanted to walk straight to the bed, open the torn collar, and pull the truth into the light before anyone could bury it again. But the hallway was no longer a hallway. It had become a courtroom, and everyone had already been assigned a role. Dr. Harlan saw her and pointed toward the small administrative room near the ER entrance. His face carried the hard relief of a man who believed the newest evidence supported the conclusion he had already reached. Claire had disappeared after being removed from the case. Another transport worker had been found injured near her. Supplies were scattered. Her throat was bruised, but his eyes did not stop there long enough to ask why. To him, each detail proved escalation, not danger. He ordered Daniels to bring her in for an incident statement and told Mia to stay with the patient until animal control arrived. The German Shepherd heard that. From inside Trauma Bay 3 came a scraping sound, then a deep, broken growl that cut beneath the human voices. Claire turned toward it. The K9 was trying to stand again. Through the gap between bodies, she saw his front paws claw at the floor as one of the gray uniformed men moved closer to the gurney. The dog's injured shoulder trembled so violently that his whole body seemed to shake, but he still placed himself between the man and the unconscious patient. He did not bark at Mia. He did not bare his teeth at the respiratory tech. His warning remained fixed on the imposters. Claire took one step toward him. Daniels caught her arm, firmer this time, not because he believed she was wrong, but because he knew every eye in the ER was waiting for her to resist. She stopped herself before the movement became another accusation. The K9's gaze locked onto hers from across the room. Even through pain, his discipline held. He did not charge. He did not break position. He only scraped one paw against the floor in short, urgent strokes, the sound like a coded warning against tile. Dr. Harlan mistook the sound for aggression and ordered the trauma bay cleared. He said the dog was escalating because Claire had encouraged attachment. He said the patient's rising heart rate proved environmental stress. He said the safest option was still removal. Each sentence turned the living facts in front of him into something small enough to fit inside hospital policy. Claire listened, without interruption. She had learned long ago that arguing while powerful people were defending their pride only made them cling tighter to the mistake. Inside the administrative room, the air was stale and too warm. There was a desk, 2 chairs, an outdated employee rights poster, and a computer that had not been logged into for hours. Daniels stood by the door instead of sitting. Claire remained near the wall, the basin of wound supplies still in her hands. Doctor. Harlan entered behind them with a printed incident form and began listing what he called the known facts. Claire had assaulted 3 medical transport workers in the hall. She had refused a direct order to step away from a dangerous animal. She had entered a restricted supply area after being removed from the case. A fourth altercation had occurred there. Until review, she was suspended from patient care duties. The phrasing was clean. That made it more dangerous. Claire placed the basin on the desk, careful not to let the fake ID show. She explained, in a calm voice, that the official transport company had confirmed no crew had arrived yet, that the paperwork contained false contact information, that one of the men carried an unmarked syringe, and that the patient reacted physically to the phrase clean transfer. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse Dr. Harlan of ego or negligence. She simply laid the details out in order, the way she would chart a decline in blood pressure before a crash. Dr. Harlan listened with the expression of a man waiting for his turn to dismiss everything. When she finished, he told her that stress, confusion, and personal history could make even experienced nurses misread a chaotic situation. He said her compassion for military patients was known, but compassion did not authorize violence. He said the hospital would investigate the transport discrepancy while keeping the immediate priority on staff safety. Staff safety. The phrase sounded noble until Claire pictured the German shepherd bleeding beside the gurney, protecting a man whose name had been cut out of every object he owned. Daniels's radio hissed with static again. He adjusted the channel, frowned, then lowered the volume. Claire noticed. Dr. Harlan did not. The compact radio from the supply room had not merely been for communication. It might have been interfering with internal channels. That meant the men had prepared for more than a quick pickup. They had prepared for confusion. A sharp scrape came from outside the room. Then another. The sound carried through the closed door, faint but unmistakable. The K9 was clawing at something. Not attacking, clawing. Claire closed her eyes for half a second and mapped the trauma bay from memory. Door on the right. Supply counter inside. Gurney centered. Patient belongings on the chair. If the dog was clawing wood or metal, he might be at the lower cabinet beside the bed, trying to block access to the belongings. Or he might be at the door because the men had moved the patient. Claire opened her eyes. He's warning us. Dr. Harlan looked exhausted by her certainty. He is an injured animal under stress. He warned before the syringe. He warned before the false paperwork. He warned before the supply room attack. And yet the only confirmed injuries in this department tonight were caused by you. That sentence was meant to end the conversation. It almost did. Then the door opened just enough for Mia to slip inside, her face pale and her hands trembling around a stack of printed vitals. She had no reason to be there unless she had chosen one. Dr. Harlan snapped that she was supposed to remain with the patient, but Mia did not retreat. She looked at Claire first, then at Daniels, and finally forced herself to speak to the attending. Her words came fast but not careless. She said the camera feed inside Trauma Bay 3 had gone dark for nearly 90 seconds before the fight in the hall. She had checked the monitor station herself. The auxiliary camera cable had been loosened at the wall. One of the gray-uniformed men had stood near that exact corner before the feed dropped. For the first time, Dr. Harlan had no immediate answer. Claire did not let her face change. Hope could make people reckless. Mia had given them a crack, not a rescue. The hospital still had Claire on hallway video fighting men in uniforms. The patient still wore the wrong name. The dog was still bleeding. And the two remaining imposters were still close enough to finish what they had come to do. Daniels stepped away from the door and spoke carefully, saying the man in the supply room had been carrying a fake badge and a radio that appeared to be interfering with security channels. He did not make a speech. He did not defend Claire completely. He simply placed another fact on the table. Facts were becoming harder for Dr. Harlan to avoid. From the hall, the German shepherd barked. 3 sharp bursts. Mia flinched. Claire moved before anyone could stop her, not toward the main door, but toward the staff exit at the back of the administrative room. Dr. Harlan ordered her to stay where she was. She turned as if to comply, letting his attention settle on her face while her hand slipped into the basin and closed around the trauma shears. Not as a weapon, as a key for the collar, a tool for the wound, and perhaps the only way to reveal what the men wanted hidden. She looked at Mia and gave the smallest shake of her head, asking without words for silence. Mia understood. The young nurse stepped slightly sideways. blocking Dr. Harlan's view of the basin just long enough for Claire to tuck the shears and hemostatic gauze beneath her scrub top. Daniels saw it too. He looked away. That was his choice. "Doctor." Harlan began calling risk management from the desk phone, finally admitting that something about the transport team required formal review. He thought that was action. He thought a phone call could slow men who had already forged paperwork, jammed radios, carried sedatives, and followed a nurse into a supply room. Claire knew better. The next few minutes would not wait for policy. She lowered her voice and asked to collect her personal bag from the staff alcove before being escorted out. The request sounded defeated enough to satisfy the version of her Dr. Harlan wanted to believe in. Quiet Claire. Compliant Claire. A nurse finally remembering her place. He allowed it. Daniels opened the back door and walked with her into the short service corridor that looped behind the trauma rooms. The moment they were out of Dr. Harlan's sight, Claire stopped. The canine barked again from the other side of the wall, this time followed by the crash of something metal hitting the floor. Daniels did not ask what she was going to do. He only stepped aside. Claire moved down the service corridor, gauze under her scrub top, fake ID in her pocket, trauma shears cold against her wrist. Ahead, the rear entrance to Trauma Bay 3 stood partly open, and through the gap she saw one of the gray uniformed men bending over the wounded German Shepherd's collar, while the other reached for the unconscious patient's bed rail. The hospital had made Claire the suspect. The dog knew she was the only one left who could stop the patient from disappearing. Claire entered Trauma Bay 3 through the rear service door just as the bearded man reached for the German Shepherd's collar. He had one knee on the floor, one hand braced against the gurney, and the other hovering over the torn padding at the dog's neck, with the careful greed of someone reaching into a safe. The canine was too weak to rise fully. His front paws scraped against the tile, his wounded shoulder trembling under its own weight, but his teeth still showed. He was holding the line with almost nothing left, except training and loyalty. The second man stood at the head of the gurney, fingers already on the bed rail, preparing to unlock it. John Doe, 47, lay beneath the blanket with his eyes closed, but his body was no longer still. His hand had clenched around the sheet, and the monitor beside him showed a pulse climbing in uneven bursts. Somewhere inside the fog of injury, sedation, and whatever had been done to him before he reached the ER, the patient knew danger had come close again. Claire did not rush straight at them. That would have turned the wounded dog, the unconscious man, and the narrow trauma bay into a crush of bodies and panic. Instead, she let the service door close softly behind her and moved along the wall where the shadows from the overhead lights broke against the cabinets. The bearded man heard the faint shift of her shoes and looked up. For half a second, annoyance crossed his face before fear returned. He had expected security, maybe Mia, maybe a doctor, finally asking questions too late. He had not expected Claire to come back through the rear entrance, with hemostatic gauze tucked under her scrub top and trauma shears hidden against her wrist. The man at the head of the bed stepped away from the rail and reached under his jacket. Claire lifted the fake ID badge she had taken from the supply room and held it where both men could see it. She did not need to say much. The badge, the broken syringe case, the dead radio, the false paperwork, and the official transport call were beginning to form a chain, and men like them understood chains better than speeches. Their window was closing. The bearded man's hand dropped back toward the collar. The German Shepherd growled, but the sound broke halfway through. His legs folded slightly. Pain flashed across his eyes. Claire saw the collapse coming and crossed the room at last, not toward the men, but toward the dog. She placed herself between his neck and the bearded man's hand, lowering her body enough that the canine could see her face. The room held its breath around them. Claire kept her palm open and low. Her throat still ached from the supply room attack, and every breath pulled against her bruised ribs, but her voice stayed steady. She used the tone she had used with wounded soldiers who woke under helicopters, with frightened veterans who mistook hospital lights for flares, with working dogs trained to obey commands, even when pain tried to turn the world red. The German Shepherd's eyes locked on hers. His pupils were wide. His muzzle trembled. Blood ran in a narrow line from the shoulder wound to the floor. She did not touch the collar first. She touched the wound. That mattered. The dog flinched so violently that the gurney rail rattled, but he did not bite. Claire pressed the hemostatic gauze gently against the open shoulder and used her other hand to steady him beneath the chest, taking just enough of his weight to keep him from falling. The canine's breathing came hard and fast. He looked past her once, toward the unconscious man, as if asking whether leaving his post for even a second would be betrayal. Claire shifted her body so he remained angled toward the bed. She treated him without turning him away from the patient. Only then did the tension in his jaw ease. The man near the head of the bed took one step forward, and Claire heard the movement before she saw it. The canine heard it too. His ears lifted. Claire did not look away from the dog, but she let the trauma shears slide into her palm. The man stopped. Perhaps he finally understood that she was not distracted. She was doing 3 things at once: controlling the wound, reading the dog, and tracking the room. Mia appeared at the main doorway, half hidden behind the frame, her face pale but determined. Daniel stood somewhere behind her in the hall, blocking the view from the nurse's station with his broad shoulders. Neither of them entered. They were giving Claire seconds, maybe less, and Claire used them. She wrapped pressure around the canine's shoulder with quick, careful turns, firm enough to slow the bleeding but not so tight that he would feel trapped. The dog's breath steadied by degrees. His eyes remained on her. When she finally moved her hand toward the torn padded collar, he did not pull away. Instead, with visible effort, he lowered his head and turned his neck toward her fingers. The bearded man swore under his breath. Claire heard the fear in it. The collar had been modified by someone who understood durability. Beneath the outer leather was a second layer of reinforced fabric, stitched in dark thread nearly invisible against old blood. The tear from the earlier struggle had opened part of the seam, revealing the edge of something metallic tucked inside a hidden pocket. Claire cleaned the blood away with gauze, then positioned the trauma shears carefully. One wrong pull could hurt the dog or damage whatever evidence he had carried this far. The German Shepherd stood perfectly still. It was not the stillness of exhaustion. It was obedience. Trust. A working dog offering access to the one place he had defended against everyone else. Claire cut the first stitch. The patient's monitor beeped faster. She cut the second. The man at the bed shifted again, and Mia stepped into the doorway fully this time. Her voice was quiet but firm as she told him not to touch the rail. The words were not loud, not dramatic, but they carried the first real courage Claire had seen from the room beyond herself and the dog. The man glared at Mia but did not move closer. Daniels had likely stepped into view behind her. The imposters were losing the power that came from being mistaken as official. Claire slid 2 fingers into the opened seam. The object inside was slick with dried blood and pressed deep into the padding. She eased it out slowly, feeling its chain snag once on a thread before coming free. When it dropped into her palm, the room seemed to narrow to the weight of it. A Navy SEAL dog tag. Old. Scratched. Darkened by blood that had dried into the stamped letters. Not a decorative replica. Not a souvenir. Real metal, real wear, real history. Claire rubbed the surface with the edge of clean gauze until the name appeared beneath the stains. Elias Rourke. For a moment, nothing in the trauma bay moved. Claire looked from the tag to the hospital band on the unconscious man's wrist. John Doe, 47. The printed label looked suddenly obscene in its neatness. It had reduced a life, a service record, and perhaps a betrayal into a number that could be transferred, sedated, misplaced, or forgotten. But the dog tag in her hand had a name, a real one. A name the men in gray had crossed too many lines to keep hidden. The bearded man saw the tag and went pale. The man at the head of the bed reached for his jacket again, faster this time. Daniels entered before he could finish the motion. The guard did not tackle him. He simply stepped into the room with enough authority to make movement expensive. Mia moved to the patient's side and placed herself near the IV line, hands shaking but ready to protect it. Claire closed her fingers around the dog tag and tucked it beneath the blood-stained gauze wrapped around her own wrist. Only then did the name strike deeper than the moment. Elias Rourke. Claire had seen that name before. Not in a hospital chart. Not in a newspaper. Years earlier, before she became the quiet night nurse everyone underestimated, she had seen it in a sealed casualty appendix attached to a mission file that was never supposed to exist in full. The file had listed Elias Rourke as lost under dishonorable circumstances, suspected of abandoning a team during a covert extraction. Claire had been a medic on the outer edge of that operation, far enough away to be told almost nothing, close enough to remember the silence that followed. She remembered the way senior officers stopped speaking when his name appeared. She remembered a handler's dog listed as unrecovered. She remembered the word compromised, stamped across pages that smelled of toner and fear. Now that supposedly disgraced man was lying under hospital lights with a false name on his wrist, and the unrecovered dog was bleeding at Claire's knees, carrying his tag like a buried verdict. The German shepherd pushed his muzzle weakly against her hand. Claire looked down at him. His eyes had changed. The desperation had not vanished, but something in him had settled. He had done what he came to do. He had delivered the name to someone who understood that names mattered. Then the lights flickered. At first it was only a tremor in the overhead panels, a brief dimming that made every shadow in the trauma bay jump. The monitors chirped, reset their brightness, and steadied. "Doctor," Harlan's voice sounded from the hallway, demanding to know why Daniels had entered the room. Someone at the nurse's station called out that the system had just lost one camera feed again. Claire lifted her head. The bearded man smiled. It was small, but she saw it. The lights flickered a second time, longer now. The monitor beside Elias Rourke gave a warning tone. The automatic door to the medication alcove clicked as its lock reset. Somewhere down the corridor, a generator alarm began to pulse. Claire's hand tightened around the hidden dog tag beneath her wrist wrap. The third flicker became darkness. For one heavy second, the ER disappeared. Then, the red emergency lights came on, washing Trauma Bay 3 in the color of blood. The German shepherd forced himself upright with a low growl that was all warning now. Elias Rourke's pulse climbed on the monitor. Mia whispered Claire's name, but Claire was already looking at the two men in gray, whose faces had changed in the red light from cornered to ready. The collar was open. The name was found. And someone had just cut the lights to make sure neither left the room alive. The red emergency lights turned Trauma Bay 3 into a room of shadows and blood. For one long second after the blackout, nobody moved. The regular hospital brightness was gone, and with it went the illusion that rules, titles, and cameras could protect anyone. The monitors still worked on backup power, but their screens glowed dimly, casting green lines across Elias Rourke's unconscious face. The oxygen continued to hiss. Somewhere beyond the trauma bay, alarms pulsed through the ER in uneven waves as nurses called out room numbers and checked machines that had suddenly become less reliable than human hands. Claire did not waste the second. She pulled the blood-stained gauze tighter around her wrist, securing the Navy SEAL dog tag beneath the wrap where it would not flash in the red light. The metal pressed cold against her pulse. Elias Rourke's name was hidden against her skin now, no longer inside the K9's collar, no longer where the men in gray expected it to be. That gave her one advantage, but only one. The collar was open. The imposters knew the tag had been removed. The blackout had not been an accident. It was timing, and timing meant planning. Mia stood frozen near the IV line, her face pale under the red glow. Daniels had moved halfway into the room before the lights failed, but the blackout had drawn him back toward the doorway, where voices in the hall were rising, and someone was shouting that the security radios had dropped again. The bearded man and his remaining partner did not look surprised. That told Claire everything she needed to know. They had been waiting for darkness. The German shepherd understood it too. He forced himself upright beside the gurney, his bandaged shoulder trembling under fresh pressure. Claire had slowed the bleeding, not stopped it. The K9's legs shook, and every breath looked painful, but his ears were high and active. His eyes moved from one man to the other, then to the side door, then back to Claire. He was reading the room by sound and scent now, working through pain with the discipline of a dog trained for situations where panic got people killed. Claire reached one hand toward him, not touching, only signaling calm. Then she shifted into motion. The trauma bay was not built for defense, but every room had a shape, and every shape had uses. Claire locked the wheels on Elias's gurney and pulled it several inches sideways, angling it so the bed blocked the easiest path from the main door to the patient's torso. She lowered the side rail on the side nearest her, then raised the opposite one high, creating a barrier that would force anyone reaching for Elias to come through a narrow gap. She shoved the rolling supply table toward the foot of the bed and hooked its brake with her shoe. A metal kick bucket went beneath the curtain line where it would betray a careless step. The IV pole was moved closer to Mia, not as a weapon, but as something stable the young nurse could hold if someone tried to pull the line. Mia watched her, terrified but attentive. Claire did not explain everything. She only guided her with quiet instructions woven into action. Keep the IV clear. Stay near the wall. Do not chase anything dropped. Do not let anyone touch the pump unless Claire said so. Mia nodded once, swallowing hard, and placed both hands near the tubing. She was afraid, but fear had not made her useless. That mattered. The bearded man took a step toward the bed. The K9 gave a low growl. Not loud, not dramatic, directional. Claire's eyes moved to the man's right hand, half hidden behind his thigh. He was holding something small and dark, not the syringe from before. A folding knife, maybe. A tool. In the red emergency light, shape mattered more than certainty. Claire slid a stainless tray off the counter and let it rest against her forearm. The sound was soft, but the bearded man heard it. His mouth tightened. He had seen enough now to know Claire did not pick things up by accident. His partner moved toward the side door, trying to split her attention. The German Shepherd's ears snapped that direction before Claire looked. The dog's warning shifted, a low sound from deep in his chest, shorter and sharper than the first. Claire understood the difference as clearly as language. One threat close to the bed, one threat moving around. She turned the monitor volume down before anyone could use a false alarm to mask footsteps. Then she reached to the wall panel and shut off the non-essential alert tone that had been chirping since the blackout. The room became quieter, stripped to breathing, oxygen, distant shouting, and the faint scrape of rubber soles. Elias moved under the blanket. It was small, only a tightening near the jaw and a pull of the fingers against the sheet, but the bearded man saw it. He leaned closer, and his voice changed from performance to hatred. Rourke doesn't leave this room alive. The words were low, meant for Elias or Claire, or maybe only the darkness. They carried no medical disguise now, no liability language, no false transport calm. The mask had fallen because the lights had. Mia's breath caught. Claire did not look away from the man. Inside the gauze around her wrist, the dog tag seemed to burn against her skin. There it was. Confirmation. John Doe 47 was Elias Rourke. The patient was not being transferred. He was being erased. Daniels called from the doorway, asking what the man had said, but a burst of static from his radio swallowed half his words. The partner near the side door used that moment to move. He lunged toward the supply table, trying to shove it aside and reach the bed rail. The K9 moved first. Injured or not, he drove his body into the man's legs with a sharp, controlled impact. Not a full attack, but enough to break balance. The man cursed and kicked backward. Claire stepped in before he could kick the dog again, swinging the stainless tray across his forearm. The blow rang through the room. His grip opened, and a small plastic device fell to the floor. Mia saw it skitter beneath the gurney. Claire, leave it, Claire said, because the bearded man had already moved. He came around the head of the bed, fast and low, reaching for Elias's oxygen tubing. Claire intercepted him with the tray, but he expected that and drove his shoulder into her ribs. Pain burst white through her side. She staggered, hit the counter, and nearly lost her footing. The dog tag stayed hidden. That was the only thing she had time to be grateful for. The K9 barked once. Claire turned her head just enough to see the partner reaching under the gurney for the fallen device. The bark had not been fear. It was a mark. There. That one. Claire kicked the metal foot pedal of the gurney, dropping the lower frame a few inches. The man jerked his hand back before it was trapped, but the movement cost him the device. It remained beneath the bed, blinking faintly red. The bearded man grabbed Claire's wrist. Wrong wrist. His fingers closed over the gauze, hiding the dog tag. For one terrible second, she thought he had felt the metal. His eyes flicked down. Claire twisted before he could tighten his grip, letting the outer layer of gauze smear blood across his palm. She made the movement look like pain, not protection. He pulled away, annoyed by the blood, and reached again for Elias instead. The German Shepherd came between them. He did not have enough strength left for another charge. He simply placed his body against the side of the gurney, head low, teeth visible, one paw braced near Elias's hand. Claire saw what it cost him. His wounded shoulder trembled so violently that the bandage darkened beneath the wrap. But he held. The bearded man looked down at the dog with contempt. Still guarding him after all these years. Claire heard the phrase and filed it away. After all these years, the dog's history with Elias was not recent. The betrayal was old. The tag had been carried for a long time. From the hallway, Dr. Harlan's voice cut through the alarms, demanding access to the room. Daniels blocked him, shouting back that there were armed intruders inside, though the word armed came with uncertainty because no one had yet seen enough to prove it. Hospital staff gathered beyond the door, shadows moving through red light, afraid to enter and afraid to leave. The partner near the side door tried again, this time reaching for the bed brake. If he could unlock the gurney, they might still push Elias through the rear corridor during the blackout. Claire threw the stainless tray low. It hit the floor in front of his feet with a clatter, not striking him but forcing him to step back. Mia used the opening. She slammed her foot onto the bed brake and kept it there, both hands still guarding the IV line. Her face was white with fear, but she did not move away. The German Shepherd gave 2 short growls, one toward the bearded man, one toward the side door. Claire understood the second warning too late. The side door opened behind them. A shape appeared in the red-lit gap, not fully inside, just enough to block the exit. For a heartbeat, Claire thought it was the man from the supply room, somehow free. Then she saw the outline was different, broader at the shoulders, carrying something long and dark along his leg. A fourth presence, maybe backup. Maybe the real reason the blackout had been triggered. The bearded man smiled again, his face half-shadowed. "You should have handed over the tag when you had the chance." Claire's wrist tightened around the hidden metal beneath the gauze. Beside her, the German Shepherd lowered himself into a stance that should have been impossible with his injury. Elias Rourke's hand moved weakly on the blanket, searching until his fingers brushed the dog's bloodied fur. The ER alarms wailed beyond the walls. The lights stayed red, and Claire realized the blackout was not meant to help the imposters escape with Elias. It was meant to give them enough darkness to finish killing him in the room. The shape in the side doorway did not enter immediately, and that hesitation saved Claire the first second she needed. In the red emergency light, the man was only a broad outline with a long, dark object held low against his leg, his face hidden by the shadow of the service corridor. The 2 men already inside Trauma Bay 3 shifted when they saw him, not with surprise, but with relief. That told Claire he was theirs. It also told her the blackout had never been a desperate backup plan. It had been a scheduled step. Claire moved before the doorway. Man could choose his angle. She hooked her foot under the metal kick bucket she had placed near the curtain line and snapped it sideways across the floor. It spun into the side entrance with a hard clatter, striking the newcomer's shin and forcing him to look down. At the same moment, the German Shepherd gave a short, controlled bark toward the bearded man near Elias Rourke's head. Claire followed the warning without turning fully. She drove her elbow backward into the bearded man's ribs just as his hand reached for Elias's oxygen tubing. The blow did not drop him, but it broke his timing. That was all Claire needed. She caught the tubing before he could pull it free, looped it back over the bed rail, and shoved her shoulder into the gurney to keep Elias centered. Mia stayed planted near the IV pump, one foot still locked on the bed brake, her hands shaking around the line but not letting go. The young nurse had fear written across her face, yet she stayed exactly where Claire needed her. In a room full of men trying to erase a patient, Mia's refusal to move became its own kind of courage. The man at the side door recovered and stepped in. The long object in his hand was not a rifle. It was a collapsible baton, extended with a flick that cut through the alarms. He swung toward Claire's shoulder, aiming to break her balance and clear a path to the bed. Claire did not meet the strike head-on. She stepped into the narrow space between the gurney and the counter, letting the baton smash into the cabinet edge where her arm had been a heartbeat earlier. The sound rang through the trauma bay. Before he could pull back, she kicked the cabinet door open into his knee. He staggered. The K9 moved. He did not have enough strength for a full attack, but he had enough discipline for a precise one. He lunged low, not for the man's throat or face, but for the wrist holding the baton. His teeth closed around the sleeve and skin just long enough to force the weapon down. Then he released before Claire even spoke, backing toward Elias with a painful limp that nearly took him to the floor. The bearded man saw the dog weaken and lunged for him. Claire intercepted with the IV pole. She swung it horizontally, not wildly, but like a barrier, catching the man across the forearms and driving him back from the K9. The pole bent against the force. He grabbed it with both hands and tried to wrench it from her. Claire let him take it halfway, then released suddenly. His own pull sent him backward into the rolling supply table. Mia kicked the brake free at the exact wrong or right moment, and the table shot into his legs. He went down hard against the side of the gurney but kept one hand on the blanket, dragging it with him. Elias Rourke's hand emerged from beneath the sheet. His fingers brushed the German Shepherd's bloodied fur. The dog lowered his head at the touch, and for one fragile instant, the fight seemed to pause around something older than the room. A wounded handler and a wounded K9, both half-conscious in different ways, still reaching for each other through years of lies. Claire felt the dog tag beneath the gauze at her wrist and understood why men had come to kill for it. A name was not just a name, when powerful people had survived by burying it. The baton man came again, faster this time, fury replacing caution. Claire grabbed a sealed pack of saline from the counter and threw it low. It burst under his step, slicking the tile. His boot slid, and his swing went wide. Claire stepped inside the arc, caught his elbow, and guided the momentum downward until his shoulder hit the bed rail. He tried to turn his strength against her, but she drove 2 fingers into the nerve point above his wrist and folded his arm across the rail. The baton dropped. She kicked it under the cabinet. The partner near the rear exit, the one who had been trying to unlock the gurney, used the distraction to reach for the hidden device under the bed. The German Shepherd growled twice, sharp and urgent. Claire heard direction in the sound. Low, left, under. She snapped her head down in time to see the man's fingers close around the blinking device. Mia moved first. She snatched the metal kick bucket from the floor and slammed it down over his hand. The man shouted, more angry than injured, but the device stayed trapped beneath the bucket. Mia recoiled immediately, horrified at herself, but she had done enough. Claire seized the moment. She grabbed a pressure wrap from the counter, looped it around the rear exit man's forearm as he rose, and pulled him across the lowered bed rail. His ribs hit the metal edge. He swung blindly with his free hand, catching Claire near the cheek. Pain flashed hot across her face. She did not answer with anger. She answered with leverage, turning his trapped arm until he dropped to one knee beside the gurney. The bearded man crawled toward the K9. This time, he did not reach for the collar. He reached for the dog himself. His hand closed around the loose skin at the back of the German Shepherd's neck, and he dragged the wounded animal just far enough from Elias that the dog's paws slipped in his own blood. The K9 gave a sound Claire would remember for years, not a cry of fear but one of rage trapped inside pain. The bearded man pulled a small knife from his sleeve and held it near the dog's throat. The room went still. Claire released the man she had pinned, because she had no choice. Mia froze beside the IV pump. Daniels shouted from the doorway, but the baton man had staggered into his path, blocking entry. In the hallway beyond, Dr. Harlan's voice demanded someone tell him what was happening, but nobody outside the red-lit trauma bay could understand the shape of the danger clearly enough to act. The bearded man looked at Claire's bandaged wrist. This time, his eyes stayed there. He knew. "Give me the tag," he said, his voice no longer pretending to be medical, official, or calm. Or, "I open the dog right here." Claire looked at the German Shepherd. His body trembled under the man's grip. His injured shoulder was bleeding through the wrap. His eyes found hers, still alert, still waiting. Not begging, waiting. That was the difference. A pet might panic. A working K9 waited for command. Claire let her hand move slowly toward the gauze at her wrist. The bearded man watched the motion, hungry for the metal hidden beneath it. Claire lowered her voice, shaping the words as if speaking only to him, but her eyes never left the dog. "Mercy. Hold." The K9 became still. The bearded man's eyes flicked up. Claire saw recognition break through his face. For 1 second, he was not looking at a nurse anymore. He was looking at a ghost from a file he had been told was closed. The old call sign had landed exactly where Claire hoped it would, inside whatever memory tied these men to the mission that had erased Elias Rourke. He whispered, almost involuntarily, "Mercy 6?" Claire moved on the second word. She tore the outer gauze from her wrist and threw it toward his face. Not the dog tag, only the bloodied wrap. His eyes followed it by instinct. The K9 acted at the same instant. Not wild, not uncontrolled. He snapped upward and clamped his teeth around the man's knife wrist, biting just hard enough to break grip. The knife fell. Claire kicked it away, caught the man's arm, and drove him backward into the cabinet with a force that emptied his lungs. The German Shepherd released the moment Claire touched the attacker's wrist. Perfect discipline. Claire locked the bearded man's elbow against the counter edge, then used the pressure wrap to bind his forearm to the cabinet handle. He fought with a desperate strength, but desperation made him predictable. Daniels finally forced his way past the baton man and tackled him against the wall. Mia, shaking but focused, kicked the knife farther under the bed and dragged the trap device away from the gurney with the toe of her shoe. The rear exit man tried to rise again. The K9 growled once. He stopped. For a moment, the only sounds were the monitors, the alarms, and the rough breathing of people who had come very close to dying in a hospital room where no one was supposed to fight at all. Claire pulled the real dog tag from beneath the inner layer of gauze and slipped it into the pocket inside her scrub top, closer to her heart. The bearded man watched the movement with hatred so deep it had outlived whatever orders brought him there. As Daniels cuffed the baton man, Claire noticed the tattoo on the bearded man's wrist, exposed where his sleeve had torn during the struggle. In the red emergency light, the lines were hard to make out, but the shape was unmistakable. The same emblem pressed into the magnetic card from the supply room, the same shape missing from the cut piece of uniform fabric in Elias's belongings. It was not an official Navy mark. It was a shadow unit mark, one used by people who wanted the benefits of service without the burden of honor. The bearded man saw her recognize it. His mouth twisted into something like a smile. "You think the tag saves him?" he rasped. The commander signed it. The words struck the room harder than any blow. Claire did not know which commander he meant, but she knew what he wanted her to feel: doubt. If a commander had signed the order that erased Elias Rourke, then the lie was not just the work of 3 imposters in gray uniforms. It reached back into the same sealed past that had buried Mercy 6, the same past Claire had spent years pretending would never follow her into a civilian ER. The emergency lights flickered again. This time, they steadied. White light flooded back through the trauma bay, harsh and exposing. The darkness vanished, leaving behind 3 subdued men, a wounded K9 standing over Elias Rourke, Mia with blood on her shoes, Daniels breathing hard beside the wall, and Claire Monroe in torn scrubs with a bruised throat and an old call sign hanging in the air. "Doctor." Harlan stepped into the room and stopped. For once, he had no words ready. When the white lights came back on, Trauma Bay 3 looked worse than it had in the dark. Darkness had hidden the blood until the room could pretend the danger was still theoretical. Now everything was visible. The red smear beneath the German Shepherd's injured shoulder, the overturned supply table, the broken plastic device Mia had kicked away from the bed, the baton under the cabinet, the knife beneath the gurney, the gray uniformed men restrained against the wall and floor. Claire Monroe stood near Elias Rourke's bed with torn scrubs, a bruised throat, and blood drying across both hands, while the wounded K9 kept his body pressed against the gurney as though he still did not trust the room to stay safe. For a moment, no one spoke. Dr. Harlan stood in the doorway with the expression of a man whose certainty had run too far ahead of the facts and left him with no clean way back. Behind him, nurses crowded the hall, trying to see without entering. Security voices overlapped near the nurses' station. Someone had called local police again. Someone else was demanding risk management, hospital administration, and animal control, all at once. The ER had become what Dr. Harlan had feared most: uncontrollable, exposed, and full of witnesses. But even now, the first story still had power. Claire knew it by the way people looked at her. They saw the subdued men, yes, but they also saw that she had been at the center of every violent moment. She had fought in the hall. She had fought in the supply room. She had fought in the blackout. The cameras had missed too much and captured just enough to make her look dangerous. A nurse with unexplained combat skills was harder for a hospital to accept than a forged transfer team, because accepting her meant admitting how badly everyone else had failed. Dr. Harlan found his voice at last. He ordered Daniels to secure all 3 men and told Mia to step away from the patient's IV line. He tried to make the room feel official again by naming tasks, assigning staff, and turning chaos into reportable categories. Then he looked directly at Claire and said she was still removed from patient care pending investigation. His tone carried less confidence now, but not enough humility. Claire did not argue. She reached into her scrub pocket and placed the fake ID badge on the counter where the overhead light could show its flaws. The laminate edge had split during the struggle. The barcode was flat ink, not embedded. The hospital affiliation listed a department name that had not existed for years. Beside it, she placed the magnetic card with the faded emblem, careful to keep her fingers on the edges. "This came from the man who followed me into the supply room," she said, her voice rough from the bruising at her throat. The compact radio he carried interfered with Daniels's channel. The syringe case under the medication cabinet has no pharmacy label. The transfer form uses a dead extension. The official transport company confirmed they had not arrived. She did not say you were wrong. She did not need to. The room had enough evidence now to hear the words without her speaking them. Mia stepped forward before fear could stop her. Her hands were still shaking, but she held herself straighter than she had an hour earlier. She told Dr. Harlan that the auxiliary camera in Trauma Bay 3 had gone dark before the first confrontation, and that one of the gray uniformed men had stood beside the cable port moments before the feed dropped. She explained that the main hallway camera had not captured the hand twisting the K9's collar, the unmarked syringe, or the moment the men tried to reach the patient during the blackout. She did not embellish. She simply reported what she had seen. Daniels added that the man in the side doorway had been carrying a collapsible baton and that the device Mia trapped under the kick bucket appeared to be connected to the camera outage. He spoke with the careful discipline of a security officer who understood that every word might become part of a legal record. His voice did not shake. That helped the room change shape around the truth. "Doctor?" Harlan looked from the fake ID to the restrained men. The bearded one, the man who had held a knife to the K9's throat, stared back at him without fear. His wrist was cuffed to the lower rail of the supply counter, and the torn sleeve exposed the tattoo Claire had seen in the red light. The same shadowed emblem on the magnetic card, the same missing shape from the cut uniform fabric in Elias's belongings. Claire saw Dr. Harlan notice it. At last, his eyes moved to the unconscious patient with something other than dismissal. The hospital band still said John Doe 47. The label looked small now, almost childish, against everything the night had revealed. Elias lay motionless, but his fingers remained tangled in the German shepherd's fur. The dog had lowered himself beside the bed again, exhausted beyond pride, yet his head stayed raised. When a local officer stepped too close to the patient's belongings, the K9 gave a low warning without showing teeth. He was not guarding the room from everyone. He was guarding specific things from specific people. Even Dr. Harlan could no longer pretend that did not matter. Claire reached beneath the inner fold of her scrub top and removed the Navy SEAL dog tag. She held it in her palm for only a moment before setting it beside the fake ID. The metal was old, scratched, and darkened with dried blood, but the stamped name remained clear. Elias Rourke. The effect was immediate, though not dramatic in the way movies made truth dramatic. No one gasped. No music rose. The ER simply became quieter. People understood names. A John Doe could be transferred, restrained, ignored, doubted, or filed away. Elias Rourke had weight. Elias Rourke had a record. Elias Rourke had been someone before the hospital printed him into a number. Dr. Harlan stared at the tag. "Where did you get this?" Claire looked down at the German shepherd. He carried it in his collar. The K9's ears shifted at her voice, but he did not rise. His strength was nearly gone. Claire could see the bandage at his shoulder darkening again. The dog had done everything asked of him by men who were not there to thank him. He had crossed rain, pain, and pursuit to bring one piece of metal to a hospital full of people ready to ignore it. Mia touched Claire's arm lightly and whispered that the dog needed surgery. Claire nodded but kept her eyes on Dr. Harlan. If the hospital removed the K9 now without securing the evidence, the men in gray would still have room to twist the story. Every truth needed a witness, with authority beyond the ER. "Call the military liaison," Claire said. Dr. Harlan did not resist this time. He told the unit clerk to contact the regional military medical liaison line and put it on speaker. The first transfer took too long. The second line required credentials. The third person who answered became very quiet when the clerk read the name from the dog tag. Elias Rourke. The liaison asked for the number again. Claire gave it, reading the stamped digits carefully. The line went silent except for keyboard clicks and distant voices. When the liaison returned, his tone had changed. He requested that no one move the patient, the dog, the tag, the false IDs, or the restrained men until federal military investigators were contacted. He asked whether the patient had been admitted under another name. Doctor. Harlan answered that he was listed as John Doe 47. The liaison went silent again. Then he asked who had found the tag. Claire did not answer immediately. She looked at the German Shepherd, at Mia, at Daniels, at the fake badge on the counter, and finally at Elias. The K9 brought it in, she said. I only opened the collar. The liaison requested a secure video connection. Hospital administration, suddenly awake to the seriousness of the situation, sent a portable, encrypted tablet down from the command office. It arrived in the hands of a nervous administrator wearing a suit jacket over a wrinkled shirt, his face carrying the panic of a man realizing the hospital's legal exposure had grown teeth. He began asking questions too quickly, but stopped when the liaison's face appeared on the tablet and instructed him to preserve the scene. The first officer on the screen wore a uniform Claire did not recognize. He listened to the summary, looked at the dog tag through the camera, and asked for a clearer view of the emblem on the bearded man's wrist. When Daniels turned the man's arm slightly, the officer's face hardened. He said nothing about what the mark meant. Instead, he said another person needed to join the call. Several seconds passed. The screen shifted. An older man appeared, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, seated in a room with no decorations behind him. He wore civilian clothes, but everything about his posture carried command. His eyes moved across the scene through the tablet. The restrained men, the fake ID, the dog tag, the unconscious patient, the wounded German Shepherd, Mia at the IV line, Daniels near the door, Dr. Harlan looking increasingly pale. Then his gaze landed on Claire. The room seemed to narrow around the tablet. The older man leaned closer to the camera. His expression changed, not with surprise exactly, but with the weight of recognition arriving from a past everyone else in the ER had only begun to sense. For a long moment, he said nothing. Claire felt the old name coming before he spoke it. She felt it in the place beneath her ribs, where Mercy had lived before Claire Monroe learned to pass medications, chart vitals, and let people underestimate her. She wanted to stop him. She wanted one more night as only a nurse. But Elias Rourke lay under a false name. The K9 was bleeding beside him, and the truth had already demanded more than silence. The commander's voice came through the speaker, low and stunned. Mercy 6. Every person in Trauma Bay 3 turned toward Claire. Dr. Harlan's face drained of color. Mia looked at her not with fear, but with awe and confusion. Daniels only lowered his eyes slightly, as if some part of him had suspected that the quiet nurse's calm had been earned somewhere far from hospital walls. The bearded man laughed once under his breath, bitter and defeated, because the name had escaped containment. Claire did not deny it. She stood beside Elias Rourke's bed, one hand resting lightly on the wounded German Shepherd's back, the dog tag lying under the white hospital lights between a fake identity and a real one. For the first time that night, the hospital understood that Claire Monroe had not wandered into a secret. She had survived the same darkness that created it. The commander did not explain Claire first. He explained Elias Rourke, because the man in the bed had been nameless longer than anyone in that hospital could understand. On the tablet screen, the older man's face held the controlled grief of someone who had carried a sealed truth for years and hated every order that kept it sealed. He asked that the room be cleared of anyone not medically necessary or part of security. Doctor. Harlan began to object out of reflex, then stopped when the military liaison repeated the request with the kind of calm that made it no longer sound optional. Mia stayed because Elias's IV line still needed watching. Daniel stayed because 3 men in gray uniforms were restrained in the room, and one of them had already held a knife to a wounded K9's throat. Claire stayed because the commander had called her Mercy 6 in front of everyone, and because the German Shepherd, bleeding and exhausted, had placed his head against her shin, as if her presence was now part of his mission. Doctor, Harlan remained near the doorway, no longer leading the room but unable to leave the consequences of his judgment behind. The commander's name was Thomas Vey. Claire remembered him younger, sharper, with a voice that could cut through helicopter noise and panic. The years had put gray into his hair, but they had not softened his eyes. He looked at Elias through the tablet, then at the dog tag lying on the counter beside the false ID. Elias Rourke was not a drifter, Vey said. He was not a stolen valor case. He was a Navy SEAL attached to a classified extraction that went wrong 12 years ago. The words settled into the room slowly. They did not explode. They sank. Mia's hand tightened near the IV pump. Doctor. Harlan lowered his eyes toward the temporary band around Elias's wrist, and for the first time he seemed to understand how cruelly small John Doe 47 looked against the name now spoken aloud. Vey continued, measuring each sentence as if some part of him still expected the old walls to close around it. Elias had been part of a joint operation designed to pull a compromised informant and 2 wounded civilians out of hostile territory after an intelligence leak exposed their route. The official report, the one most people were allowed to see, claimed Rourke broke formation, abandoned his position, and vanished with sensitive material. It had labeled him compromised. Later summaries suggested he had either died, fleeing accountability, or survived as a traitor under another name. Those summaries followed him like a stain, even after his family stopped receiving answers and his service record disappeared behind sealed references no one would fully explain. Claire listened without moving. She had known pieces. Not the whole. Never the whole. She remembered the outer edge of that night. The smell of rotor fuel, a field surgical kit open across her knees, 2 wounded men pulled from a transport that should never have been hit. She had been a covert medic attached under a call sign instead of a real name, brought in only when official medical channels could not exist on paper. Mercy 6. She had stabilized who she was told to stabilize, followed evacuation protocols, and later signed statements with more black ink than visible words. Elias Rourke had been a name in a sealed appendix, then a rumor, then a warning whispered by people who believed asking too much was a good way to lose a career. On the screen, Vey's jaw tightened. Rourke did not abandon his team. He turned back. The German Shepherd lifted his head. Everyone noticed. Vey looked at the dog, and something in the commander's expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition sharpened by pain. He asked Claire to move the tablet camera closer to the K9. Daniels did it carefully, keeping distance from the dog's muzzle. The German Shepherd watched him but did not growl. His strength was fading, but his eyes remained bright. Vey stared at the dog for several seconds before speaking again. That's Atlas. The name passed through the room like a key turning in a lock. The German Shepherd's ears shifted forward. Claire crouched beside him. Atlas, she repeated softly. The dog's eyes moved to hers, then back to Elias. The name belonged. It reached him through blood loss and fluorescent light, through years of being hunted and mislabeled, through a night when strangers had called him dangerous because they did not know how to read duty. Vey explained that Atlas had been Elias Rourke's working K9 during the operation. The dog had been listed as unrecovered after the extraction collapsed. The report said Atlas died in the field, along with evidence Rourke was accused of stealing. But that was not what happened. According to fragments Vey had gathered over the years, Elias had turned back because Atlas was wounded, and because the civilians were not the only ones left behind. He recovered a piece of evidence that proved the route had been betrayed from inside the chain, not by the team on the ground. The dog tag, stained with blood and hidden inside Atlas's collar, was not only identification. It was the last physical link placing Elias alive after the official timeline claimed he had run. Claire looked at the tag again. It seemed heavier now, too heavy for such a small piece of metal. It had carried a name, yes, but also a contradiction. If Elias Rourke had lived long enough to place or leave that tag with Atlas after the ambush, the official account was incomplete at best and deliberately false at worst. The bearded man cuffed near the counter laughed under his breath. Daniels tightened his grip on the restraint chain, but the man only smiled with blood on one lip. He said a tag proved nothing against signatures, sealed reports, and dead witnesses. His voice had lost its authority, but not its poison. He wanted the room to believe that systems were stronger than truth. Claire turned toward him. She did not raise her voice. She reminded him that the tag was only one piece. The false transport paperwork placed his team inside the hospital under fake authority. The unmarked syringe showed intent to silence the K9. The removed camera cable showed premeditation. The compact radio showed interference with security response. The magnetic card and his tattoo matched the emblem cut from Elias's uniform fabric. Mia had witnessed the camera tampering. Daniels had recovered the baton and restrained the attackers. The official transport company had confirmed the men in gray were imposters. And now Commander Vey had identified both Elias and Atlas. The room heard the chain form. This was no longer a nurse's instinct. It was evidence. Dr. Harlan stood very still. His face had gone pale in a way Claire recognized from people who finally realized their mistake had almost killed someone. He looked at Elias, then at Atlas, then at Claire. His apology did not come yet. Pride often took longer to bleed out than wounds, but the certainty had left him. Vey asked Claire to come into view. Daniels shifted the tablet. Claire stood beside Elias's bed, one hand still resting lightly on Atlas's back to keep the dog calm. Vey looked at her not as a commander addressing a subordinate, but as someone recognizing a survivor of the same sealed machinery that had buried Elias. "You were never supposed to know the final report was altered," he said. Claire felt Mia glance at her. Dr. Harlan looked up sharply. Vey explained that Mercy 6 had been kept outside the inner command channel after the extraction. Claire's medical notes had been compartmentalized. Her casualty times and stabilization records contradicted parts of the final timeline, so they had been sealed under operational necessity. Years later, when questions resurfaced, her file had been marked inactive and protected, not as a favor, but because reopening it would expose too many people. Claire had not been hiding from duty when she became a hospital nurse. She had been living under the weight of a system that taught her silence was safer than truth. The bearded man muttered that Vey had no authority to reopen anything. Vey's gaze hardened. "I have enough authority to preserve the scene, identify my men, and notify investigators who outrank whatever ghost signed your orders." The phrase struck the attacker harder than a threat. For the first time, his smile faded. At the bed, Elias moved. It began with a faint tightening of the fingers against Atlas's fur. Mia leaned in immediately, checking the monitor as the pulse changed. Claire shifted closer, careful not to crowd him. Dr. Harlan moved too, then stopped himself, allowing Mia and Claire to work without interrupting. Elias's eyelids fluttered. His breathing hitched. His face tightened with pain, memory, or both. Atlas tried to rise. Claire kept a gentle hand against his shoulders, not restraining him so much as helping him stay upright. The dog's whole body trembled. His eyes never left Elias. The room went quiet enough to hear the oxygen. Elias's lips parted. At first, no sound came out. Mia adjusted the oxygen tubing and whispered that he should not force himself, but the man had crossed too many years of silence to obey that. His fingers found the fur at Atlas's neck, exactly where the modified collar had been opened. His eyes barely opened, unfocused and glassy, but they did not search the room like a confused patient's eyes. They searched for one thing: the dog. Elias drew a shallow breath and spoke in a voice rougher than gravel. "Atlas, heel home." The command was old, soft, and unmistakable. Atlas responded before any human could. The German shepherd lowered his head onto Elias's hand, the movement immediate and precise, despite pain. His body relaxed for the first time since he had entered the ER. Not completely. A working dog never fully abandoned watch while danger remained. But the desperate edge left him. He had heard his handler. His handler knew him. No forged paperwork, no false hospital band, no sealed report could fake that bond. Mia covered her mouth with one hand. Daniels looked away. Even Dr. Harlan's face changed. Claire felt the old name Mercy 6 loosen inside her. No longer a weapon used by enemies in the dark, but a witness called back to finish something that had been left bleeding for 12 years. She picked up the dog tag and placed it carefully in Elias Rourke's hand, beneath Atlas's muzzle. Elias's fingers closed weakly around the metal. On the tablet, Commander Vey bowed his head for one brief second. The truth had not healed anyone yet. Atlas still needed surgery. Elias still needed protection. Claire still faced suspension, investigation, and the exposed past she had tried to keep buried. But the lie had cracked in a public room under hospital lights, witnessed by a nurse, a rookie, a guard, a doctor, a commander, and the dog who had known first. Elias Rourke had his name back. Now the hospital would have to answer for almost helping take it away. Mourning entered the hospital without ceremony. It did not erase the blood from Trauma Bay 3, or soften the smell of disinfectant that settled after violence. It only changed the color of the windows from black to gray, then to a pale gold that spread across the ER floor where a German shepherd had dragged himself through rain, pain, and a lie old enough to have become official. By sunrise, the men in gray uniforms were gone from the trauma bay, removed in handcuffs under the watch of hospital security, local police, and military investigators who arrived before the first pot of staff coffee had finished brewing. Their false IDs, the compact radio, the unmarked syringe case, the magnetic card, the camera device, the knife, the baton, and the forged transfer papers were all sealed and labeled. For once, the truth was not being carried by a wounded dog alone. Atlas was in surgery when the first administrative meeting began. Claire Monroe sat outside the operating suite in a borrowed hospital jacket over her torn scrub top. A bruise darkened one side of her throat. Her ribs ached whenever she breathed too deeply. Dried blood remained beneath her fingernails no matter how many times she washed her hands. Most of it was Atlas's. Some of it belonged to men who had mistaken a quiet nurse for an easy obstacle. Claire did not feel victorious. Victory was too loud a word for a morning like this. She felt tired in the deep, old way that came after surviving something and realizing survival was only the beginning of what had to be repaired. Mia sat beside her with both hands wrapped around a paper cup she had not touched. The young nurse had been cleared from immediate questioning, but the night had left its mark on her face. She had seen a hospital choose the wrong story because the wrong story looked official. She had watched an unconscious veteran nearly disappear beneath a false name. She had found her own voice, not in a grand speech, but in small acts of courage, holding the IV line, naming the camera outage, standing in a doorway when fear told her to step back. Every few minutes, she glanced at Claire as if trying to reconcile the soft-spoken night nurse with the woman a commander had called Mercy 6. Claire let her look. Some questions needed time before they deserved answers. Down the hall, Elias Rourke had been moved to a secured ICU room under military protection. His hospital band had been replaced. The new one did not say John Doe, 47. It said Elias Rourke, printed in black letters so ordinary that Claire almost had to look away when Mia showed it to her. There was nothing dramatic about the band itself. It was thin, plastic, disposable, and plain enough to be cut off with blunt scissors. But after 12 years of sealed accusations, erased records, and men arriving in false uniforms to make sure he never spoke again, that small band carried more dignity than any speech could have given him. Dr. Harlan came to the surgical waiting area just after 7. He looked older than he had at midnight. The authority had not left him, exactly, but it had lost its sharp edges. He stood near the chairs for several seconds without speaking, his eyes moving from Claire's bruised throat to the blood on her sleeve. During the night, he had used words like liability, unstable, dangerous, emotional, and assault. In daylight, those words had nowhere to hide. He told Claire the incident action against her had been withdrawn. Her badge access would remain active. Her statement would be taken as a witness report, not as a defense against misconduct. Her removal from duty would not be entered as discipline. The sentences sounded careful, as if legal counsel had shaped them before he found the courage to speak. Then he stopped hiding behind procedure and looked at her directly. "I judged too fast," he said. Claire studied him for a moment. The apology did not undo the moment he ordered her away, while Atlas bled at Elias's bedside. It did not erase the way his certainty had almost handed a wounded K9 and an unconscious veteran to men wearing lies. But it was honest, and honesty was the first clean instrument anyone had placed on the table since midnight. "You judged what looked easiest to explain," Claire said. His eyes lowered. "That may be worse." She did not comfort him. That was not her duty. Instead, she told him Atlas had recognized the threat more clearly than the hospital had. "Doctor," Harlan nodded once, and the truth of that sentence seemed to settle into him with more weight than any accusation could have. He had trusted forged paperwork over a working dog's discipline, a false label over a patient's scars, and his own pride over a nurse's observation. Those were not small mistakes. They were the kind that could cost a person his name. When Atlas came out of surgery, he was wrapped, sedated, and alive. For that morning, alive was enough. The veterinarian brought in through the military liaison explained that the shoulder wound had been deep and complicated by blood loss. There were older injuries, too. Scars that suggested Atlas had survived more than one night of being hunted. But his heart was strong. His will, the vet said quietly, had done half the work before medicine could do the rest. Claire stood beside the recovery kennel when Atlas opened his eyes. The first thing he tried to do was lift his head. The second was look past her, searching. "Elias is safe," Claire whispered. Atlas did not understand every word, but he understood her tone. His breathing eased. He lowered his head again, exhausted but no longer desperate. For the first time since he entered the ER, he slept without keeping his ears fixed toward the door. By mid-morning, Commander Vey arrived in person. He did not come with a parade of uniforms. Only one military investigator accompanied him, along with the quiet seriousness of someone who knew justice was not proven by volume. He visited Elias first, then Atlas, then Claire. When he found her near the ICU window, he held a folder under one arm and the recovered dog tag in a sealed evidence sleeve. He told her the case would not be simple, but it was open now in ways it had not been for 12 years. Elias's sealed record was being reviewed. The false dishonor attached to his name had already been flagged for correction. The men who entered the hospital were connected to an old private security network built from classified contracts, buried guilt, and people who had mistaken silence for safety. Vey did not promise that every guilty person would be exposed by sunset. Quiet justice did not work that way. It moved through sworn statements, reopened files, corrected records, and people brave enough not to look away when truth became inconvenient. Then he offered Claire a place back inside that world. Not dramatically, not as a command. He simply said there were still units that needed medics who could think under pressure, read danger before others named it, and protect the vulnerable when authority became compromised. Mercy 6 had not been forgotten by everyone. Claire looked through the glass at Elias Rourke. He was still weak, still connected to monitors, but his hand rested over the evidence sleeve holding his dog tag. Farther down the unit, Atlas slept under careful watch. No longer a dangerous animal in a hallway report, but a working K9 whose loyalty had preserved a man's name when records failed. Claire thought about the offer. Then she thought about Mia, who had learned that courage could begin with one quiet sentence. She thought about Daniels, who had chosen conscience over convenience. She thought about Dr. Harlan, who would carry the shame of almost being used as a weapon by men who understood his pride. She thought about every veteran who entered an ER with invisible wounds and visible judgment waiting at triage. There are battlefields here too, she said. Vey understood. Claire was not refusing service. She was choosing where to stand. A hospital at night could become a battlefield without gunfire. A nurse could be the only person who noticed when a label was wrong, when a working dog was not dangerous, when a patient's silence was not guilt, when the official story arrived too neatly and too fast. Later that afternoon, Elias woke long enough to see Atlas brought near his room in a recovery harness. The dog could not climb onto the bed, and Elias could barely lift his hand, but Claire guided them close enough. Atlas pressed his muzzle against Elias's fingers. Elias closed his eyes, and a tear moved silently down the side of his face. No one made a speech. No one needed to. The dog tag was placed in Elias's palm, not hidden in a collar, not sealed in a file, not carried by someone who had to bleed to protect it. His fingers curled around it with what little strength he had. Commander Vey stood at the foot of the bed. Mia stood near the IV pump. Daniels stayed by the door. Dr. Harlan remained in the hallway, giving the moment the respect of not entering uninvited. That was the lesson the hospital had almost learned too late. Not every warning arrives in language people are ready to respect. Sometimes it comes through a wounded dog, refusing to leave a bedside. Sometimes it comes through a nurse, who notices what a chart cannot say. Sometimes it comes through a veteran whose silence is mistaken for guilt, because his deepest wounds are easier to judge than understand. Elias Rourke did not need applause that morning. He needed his name spoken correctly. Atlas did not need to be treated like a hero in a parade. He needed people to understand that he had never been attacking the hospital. He had been defending the truth. And Claire Monroe did not need anyone to fear what she used to be. She needed them to respect what she had always been, a nurse who stayed when someone helpless was about to be erased. By evening, the ER returned to its usual noise. Monitors beeped. Phones rang. Patients arrived with chest pain, broken wrists, fevers, and fear. The floor had been cleaned. The broken equipment had been removed. The signs of the night were gone for anyone who had not lived through it. But some things remained. Elias Rourke had his name back. Atlas had survived. Mia had found her voice. Daniels had trusted his conscience. Dr. Harlan had learned that being in charge was not the same as being right. And Claire Monroe returned to the nurses' station quietly, without applause, without explanation, without needing anyone to call her Mercy Six again. So if this story stays with you, let it be for them. For the nurses who see what others overlook, for the working dogs who keep faith when humans fail, and for the veterans whose deepest wounds may never show on an X-ray. Because sometimes justice does not arrive with noise, headlines, or applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a hospital room at sunrise, when one forgotten name is finally placed back into the hands of the person who earned it.